I know what some of you are thinking right now. The temple was a place of prayer, a house of God. The money changers were a corruption, a side business that snuck in through the back door. Jesus drove them out because they were polluting something sacred. That's the version. That's the one everybody gets. Wrong. Not because the temple wasn't sacred. It was. But what you've been missing is that the financial operation wasn't something that snuck in. It was the architecture. It was the whole point of the outer courts. The money changing, the animal sales, the tithes, the fees. These weren't corruptions of the temple system. They were the temple system. And when Jesus walked in with a whip made of cords and flipped those tables, he wasn't cleaning up a mess. He was dismantling a central bank. That's not a metaphor. That's a budget. By the end of this video, you're going to see that scene completely differently, because once you follow the money all the way back to Solomon's original design through 4 distinct stages of financial evolution, you'll understand that what Jesus destroyed in a single afternoon had taken centuries to build. This is that story. The ancient blueprint. Let's start at the beginning, not with the corruption, with what the temple was actually designed to do. Solomon's temple, completed around 957 BC, was not primarily a building for individual worship. Ancient Israel had no equivalent of a Sunday morning congregation. The temple was a national financial institution, a centralized repository for the wealth of 12 tribes, and the primary economic engine of an entire civilization. Run the numbers for a second. In 1 Kings 10:14, records that Solomon received 666 talents of gold per year. 1 talent is roughly 75 pounds. That's 49,950 pounds of gold annually flowing into Jerusalem. In today's terms, that's in the neighborhood of $1.2 billion every year, not a one-time endowment, every single year. And gold was only one revenue stream. The temple treasury received tithes from agricultural production across the entire nation. Not a voluntary offering, a mandatory 10% of every harvest, every flock, every commercial transaction of significance. Nehemiah 13:12 describes the people bringing the tithe of grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. Those storehouses were the ancient equivalent of a central reserve. They weren't storing grain for God. They were managing the national food supply. The temple also held something economists call a lender of last resort function. When a family faced catastrophe, drought, debt, the death of a patriarch, the temple treasury was where relief came from. Deuteronomy 14:28-29 establishes the triennial tithe explicitly for this purpose, for the Levite, the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. That's a redistributive fiscal mechanism. That's a welfare budget administered through a religious institution. Picture what this looked like on the ground. A merchant caravan arriving in Jerusalem from the Galilee, loaded with olive oil. He doesn't just unload at the market. He stops at the temple precincts first. He declares his goods. He pays his tithe in kind or in currency. He receives a receipt, an acknowledgement of his obligation met. That receipt matters for his legal standing, his social standing, his ability to enter certain commercial agreements. The temple doesn't just hold the money. It validates the men who pay it. This is the system before it changed, sophisticated, structured, theologically grounded in Mosaic law, and genuinely functional as a redistributive economic institution. So how did we get from there to what Jesus walked into? Let me show you exactly. The 4 betrayals. Stage 1. The shekel monopoly. By the 2nd century BC, something had shifted in how the temple handled currency. The half-shekel tax described in Exodus 30:13, a half-shekel after the shekel of the sanctuary, had been a relatively modest annual contribution, around 2 days' wages for a laborer, manageable, accessible. But by the time of the Second Temple, the priests had established something new. Only one currency was acceptable for this tax, the Tyrian shekel, not because it was holy, because it had the highest silver purity of any coin in circulation, about 94% pure. Roman coins, the coins that ordinary Jews carried in their pockets every day, were officially considered graven images because they bore Caesar's face. They couldn't be offered in the temple. So if you came to Jerusalem for Passover, and hundreds of thousands of pilgrims did, Josephus estimates the city swelled from roughly 80,000 residents to somewhere between 300,000 and 2.7 million during the festival. You had to exchange your money. You had to go through the money changers, and the money changers charged a fee called the Corban, roughly 8% on the transaction, plus an additional fee if your coin required a second exchange. 8% on every pilgrim, every year. That's not a convenience fee. That's a tax on access to God. Stage 2, the animal market. You couldn't come to the temple empty-handed. Leviticus 1-5 establishes the sacrificial system in extensive detail. Burnt offerings, sin offerings, peace offerings, grain offerings. Different occasions required different animals. A wealthy family might bring an ox, a middle-income family, a sheep or a goat. The poorest worshippers could bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons. Luke 2:24 tells us this is exactly what Mary and Joseph brought when they presented Jesus at the temple as an infant. 2 birds, the offering of families who couldn't afford more. Now here's where stage 2 gets interesting. You could, theoretically, bring your own animal from home, but it had to pass inspection by a temple inspector. And temple inspectors had a documented habit of finding flaws in animals brought from outside, a blemish, an irregularity, a disqualification. Conveniently, the temple sold pre-approved animals inside the precincts. At a markup, the historian Edersheim, drawing on rabbinic sources, estimates that a pair of doves inside the temple courts could cost as much as a gold dinar, somewhere between 25 and 50 times the market price for the same birds outside. At one point, according to the Talmud, Rabbi Simeon ben Gamliel became so scandalized by the price of doves that he issued a public ruling halving the number of offerings required, specifically to reduce the financial burden on poor worshippers. The rabbis themselves called it out. The prices were indefensible. Stage 3, the Annas Bazaar. Here's a name that doesn't get enough attention. Annas. Annas was the former high priest, appointed by the Roman governor Quirinius around 6 AD, deposed by Rome in 15 AD, but retaining enormous influence through his 5 sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas, all of whom served as high priest after him. Annas effectively ran the high priestly family as a financial dynasty. The commercial operations within the temple courts, the money changers, the animal vendors, the inspection franchises, were collectively known in rabbinic literature as the Bazaar of the Sons of Annas, or, in Aramaic, the Chanuth. This wasn't an informal market that happened to locate itself near the temple. It was a licensed, franchised commercial operation with the high priestly family taking a cut of every transaction. Think about the structure for a moment. Annas controls the license to operate. Vendors pay for the right to operate in the court of the Gentiles. Vendors charge pilgrims inflated prices. A portion of every inflated price flows back to the house of Annas, and the house of Annas uses its wealth to maintain its political relationship with Rome, which guarantees the continuation of the system. That's a vertically integrated monopoly. That's rent extraction at every point in the supply chain. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Stage 4, the Corban loophole. This one Jesus names directly. Mark 7:9-13. The Pharisees are criticizing Jesus for allowing his disciples to eat with unwashed hands. Jesus responds by pointing to something they know. You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, "Honor your father and mother," But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is Corban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Corban was a vow. If a person declared their assets Corban, dedicated to the temple, those assets were legally protected from any other claim, including family obligations, including debts. Now watch what this meant financially. A man has aging parents who need support. Under Mosaic law, he has an absolute obligation to provide for them. Under the Corban system, he could declare his wealth dedicated to God, fulfill his temple obligations, and walk away from his family responsibilities with legal and religious cover. The wealth didn't even have to transfer immediately. He could continue using it during his lifetime. It just had to be promised to the temple upon his death. It functioned as an estate planning mechanism. It benefited the temple treasury. It gutted the family-level economic safety net that Mosaic law was specifically designed to protect, and the scribal establishment defended it on theological grounds. Jesus says, "You have made the word of God of none effect through your tradition." That's not a spiritual complaint, that's a fiscal indictment. The biblical indictment, Jeremiah 7:11. This is the verse Jesus quotes when he overturns the tables. "Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? But I have been watching, declares the Lord." The phrase, den of robbers in Hebrew, is mi'arat perisim. It's important to understand what a den of robbers is in this context. It's not the place where robbers rob people. It's the place where robbers retreat after robbing people, the hiding place, the safe house. Jesus wasn't saying the temple was the site of the crime. He was saying the temple had become the place where the proceeds of the crime were sheltered. The pilgrims were robbed on the road, metaphorically, economically, systematically, overcharged for currency exchange, forced to buy overpriced animals, stripped of family inheritance through the Corban loophole, and then the money sat in the temple treasury, consecrated, untouchable, laundered through the language of holiness. Isaiah 56:7, the other verse Jesus cites, says the temple was meant to be a house of prayer for all nations. The court of the Gentiles, the only part of the temple precinct where non-Jews were permitted, was the exact space where the bazaar operated. The one place designed to include the nations was the one place turned into a commercial floor. The people furthest from the economic system were the ones most exposed to it. Zechariah 14:21 had already anticipated the problem centuries earlier. There will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord Almighty on that day. The word translated Canaanite, Kena'ani, is the same word used for a merchant or a trader. Zechariah was saying, "The day is coming when there will be no merchants in the temple, no traders, no commercial operation wearing a religious license." Jesus read those texts. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he walked in at Passover, peak transaction volume, maximum crowd, maximum economic activity, and he shut it down. Not because money is evil, because what they had built with money was redemption and what this actually means. The system Jesus dismantled didn't die with him. The temple stood for another 4 decades before Rome destroyed it in 70 AD. But what he exposed, the mechanics of it, has never been hidden from anyone willing to read the numbers. Here's what you can do with this today. Not with your money, with your reading. The next time you open to Matthew 21, Mark 11, Luke 19, or John 2, the 4 accounts of what happened in that courtyard, don't read it as a moment of righteous anger. Read it as an economic audit. Follow the money. Ask who benefited from each element of the system. Ask what happened to the pilgrims who couldn't afford the Corban fee, who couldn't pass inspection with their home animals, who couldn't give their aging parents what the law required because their assets were tied up in a Corban vow. Ask who the system was designed to serve. The answer isn't complicated, and the fact that it took a man from Galilee, not an economist, not a Roman auditor, not a reform-minded high priest, to walk in and shut it down for a single afternoon is either the most politically naive act in the New Testament or the most precisely targeted one. Run those numbers, read those texts, and then decide which one it was. If this hit differently than you expected, share it with someone who reads Scripture and has never thought about it as an economic document. Because the whole thing is right there in the text. It always has been. Someone just had to follow the money.